Attachment to file dated November 7th, 2021. Top secret. I'm writing in despair and confusion. My thoughts are confused. The whole picture of events does not fit in my head. Something terrible is happening, and the following story is my attempt to put everything in its place and calm down. If anyone has stumbled upon these notes by accident, I ask you not to stand aside and help me with advice. Let's make it clear at once. I don't consider myself guilty of what happened to Pashka. The only thing I can be justifiably accused of is that I'm still breathing and tapping on the keys with trembling fingers. Cut to the chase. On the 9th floor of my house is the staircase to the attic, and for as long as I can remember, everyone has called it the Iron. It is a kind of parody of the usual entrance steps, only it is half the size and made not of concrete, but of welded rebar. The Iron has one span and juts into an iron hatch leading to a small booth with wires on the roof. In my childhood, there were unpleasant and creepy rumors about this booth. Some boys heard a quiet laughter coming from there, and in my teenage years I heard a story about how a grandmother from the 9th floor saw two glowing eyes in the dark on the Iron. However, no one took all these scarecrows seriously, and my grandparents, from whom I inherited my apartment on the 8th floor, never heard about such mysteries of the Iron. Since then, however, I have not cared about the Iron. Until one moment, namely the housewarming party of my classmate. Pasha Privalov was never distinguished by courage. I would even call him a winner and a coward, very nasty, but I didn't want to say it to his face. I don't know if it was out of fear or respect, but he always treated me well. Pashka was brought up by his mother and grandmother. That's probably why he had a strange and very unhealthy interest in older women, and he himself sometimes looked like a disgruntled grandmother in manners. In the institute, we had practically nothing to do with each other, except for a rare exchange of homework, but everything changed when Pashkin's relatives bought him an apartment on the 9th floor in my entrance. I was completely indifferent to our neighborhood, but Pashka considered it an incredible coincidence and did not fail to share this fact with half of our group, the half that could still digest Pashka's stories. Since then, he began to address me as neighbor, often called me to visit, bragging about his collection of vinyl records and a rare electronica record player. The invitations were frequent, but I had less and less desire to visit his dull, atmospheric apartment. That's when I threw him something humorous about the mystery of the ominous Iron. Another factor worked to my advantage. During the week, they had installed new lighting in the entrance with modern sensors that turned on with a loud click and worked as long as they detected any movement. But they worked rather strangely. A person walking downstairs was detected by the sensor without any problems, and the matte plafond flashed when the object was still on the passage between the floors, but if you go downstairs, the coveted light illuminated the floor only when the person reached the stairwell. You see, Pashka, I said, smiling, I don't want to step into the darkness, especially you have this iron thing there. I feel creepy about it, maybe some childhood trauma. But Pashka took my words seriously. A few days we did not see each other, and then began what, without exaggeration, broke my life. Even now I realize that I missed the first warning signs of his insanity. Firstly, he stopped coming to the first pair, and secondly, I couldn't hear the melodic howls of pop stars, which Pashka listened to every night on his electronica. Our unexpected meeting became the control point of all this madness. It was the end of October, the weekend before the week off according to the official version. In 2 days, I wanted to get rid of all the accumulated tasks and for 7 whole days to throw the boring institute out of my head. The weather was warm, and the utility workers were generous with the heating and stoked it as if they were trying to melt a piece of permafrost. To escape from the maddening stuffiness, I opened the window in my room and, like a newborn, gulped in the fresh air, sticking my waist out into the street. My ears were a little congested, and I did not immediately hear a thin voice, breaking into a wheeze, reciting a prayer unknown to me. There was no doubt it was Pashka praying. I leaned on the windowsill, stretched my head forward and looked up. The corner of a small book in a hard brown binding, probably a prayer book of some kind, was occasionally peeking out of Pashka's window. I called out to my neighbor. The corner of the book froze and then disappeared behind the white plastic frame, replaced by my neighbor's creepy, pale face, as pale as bloodless. I twitched slightly at what I saw, and fear slid into my chest with a brief impulse, like a fleeting burst of heartburn. Pashka rose to his full height, pulled the book out of the window and showed it to me. Then I saw that his hands were trembling. He couldn't explain what he was afraid of, so I closed the window and ran to him. Pashka opened the door on a chain and looked out through the crack. He scrutinized me carefully, as one looks at a familiar face in a faceless crowd, trying to figure out if the person in front of you is really the same person. "Is that you?" he asked quietly, his pale lips quivering and tears running down his sunken, powdered cheeks. "Who else would it be?" I grumbled. The neighbor hesitated a few seconds, closed the door, and removed the chain. As soon as I was inside, Pashka hurried to close the door on the latch, but I prevented him and suggested that it would be better to come down to my place for a cup of tea. The neighbor agreed. During our descent, Pashka furtively glanced at the stairs leading to the roof, and in his gaze I could read panic as frightened children, left home alone, look around the corner into a dark room, where a couple of minutes ago something fell or rustled loudly. At home I poured him some hot tea, gave him 3 yellow tablets of valerian, and did not demand any explanations until I was finally convinced that my neighbor had come to his senses and calmed down. Pashka started the conversation first. "Stay with me tonight," he said. "They want to kill me." I wrinkled my nose in disbelief. Then the neighbor told me what led him to such despair. My jokes about the iron struck him, planted in him a burning interest. It was only a matter of time before the mystery was explored. And a few days ago the elevator broke down in our house. Pashka then stayed late at the institute, then dropped by the store and came home in the dark. One can only imagine what emotional overload the shy student experienced, having overcome all 9 floors. The climb became an extreme for him. Adrenaline hit his head, and once he was in the stairwell, he had no doubt that he was ready to step on the iron. Having reached the iron hatch, Pashka had already completely lost his fear. It was not difficult for him to lift the lid and stick his head through the hole. Then a shriek of terror echoed through the entryway. Pashka could not explain what he saw there. Waving his hands, and as if squeezing the words out of himself, he told me. There was as if red, but also black. After surviving the horror, Pashka rushed home, locked himself in and in tears pressed his back against the door and began to listen. I've already told you that the motion sensors were triggered with a loud click. It was this click that Pashka heard, sitting under the door. The guy twitched, but immediately calmed himself. It's the lights went out after I slipped into the apartment, but immediately, like a needle sticking under a fingernail, fear painfully pricked the guy with the second click he heard. Pashka jumped to the peephole and froze. The darkness was staring at him from the other side. In bewilderment, he drew back and saw a thin ray of light penetrating into the apartment through a tiny slit near the lock. Someone standing on the other side had guessed the curious observer and closed the peephole. Whimpering with horror, Pashka collapsed into a faint. The next couple of days, everything was quiet. My neighbor even foolishly wrote off what he had seen as a dream. But the horror happened again. At night, Pashka's door was banged on with terrible force. At first he cowered in the corner of the sofa, afraid even to put his feet on the floor, but then overpowered himself and got to the peephole. In the dimly lit stairwell stood his mother. Only her face was yellow, scarred with black streaks of wrinkles. Without blinking or moving her mouth, she made sounds more like the breathlessness of a tuberculosis patient. Pashka was dumbfounded. He stood motionless, looking at the bloodshot and cataract-stricken eyes of the unknown creature that looked like his own mother, looking in horror at the mouth full of sharp yellow teeth, behind which nothing could be seen but a black yawn. Suddenly, the creepy mouth broke into a smile. The creature, as if it had learned human language, spoke in a low, rattling bass. "It's looking!" It was as if a bucket of ice had been dumped on Pashka, and he jumped away from the peephole, grabbed his prayer book from the shelf and locked himself on the balcony, where he spent the rest of the night and the whole morning. That was the end of his story. Pashka fell silent, and I didn't know what to say. Was it possible to be skeptical of the stories of a man whose hands shook again even after 3 tablets of valerianka? When Pashka spoke, his eyes were glassy, but when there was silence in the room, he looked at me so pitifully that I myself became sad and sick. "Help me, sleep at my place," he asked in a whisper. Pashka's chin was shaking, and I could hear his teeth chattering in terror. "If it's true that someone is walking, then I'll go to my mother, and if it's a dream," he sighed, averting his eyes, "then I'll go to the nut house." I of course agreed. He stayed with me till evening. He slept after a sleepless night while I was cleaning and other household chores. In the evening, when it wasn't quite dark, we went up to his place, locked up and settled in. I sat on an uncomfortable stool near the front door, like a watchman, and waited for unusual sounds. Pashka was in the room and, to distract himself, was fiddling with his record collection. Admittedly, I didn't fully realize the danger looming over us, and that night I didn't expect anything mystical or supernatural, and I certainly couldn't imagine that after all that had happened I would find a few gray hairs on the top of my head. Everything was quiet until 3 in the morning. Then there was a slightly audible metallic clang, and almost simultaneously the sensor clicked. Pashka froze in the middle of the room and looked at me, his mouth twisted in fright. I felt uneasy. While I was getting up from the stool and approaching the peephole, there were several knocks on the door. After each knock, Pashka howled like a wounded soldier. I gingerly looked through the peephole. A lump came to my throat. What I saw made me feel quite sick. My cheekbones cramped. My stomach twisted with a strong spasm. A woman was staring into my eyes from the other side. She swayed from side to side like a metronome. Her yellowed face was frozen in a ghastly smile, and 2 rows of suspiciously sharp yellow teeth did not even quiver when the grandmother said her first phrase. "Is Pasha home?" My thoughts were confused. My eyes rippled, and my head felt cast iron. I chickened out, recoiled from the peephole and squatted down, afraid that now the creature that had taken the form of Pasha's grandmother would pierce the fragile peephole with a sharp claw and cut me down like a fish. "Pasha," the nocturnal guest pulled in a ringing voice. "Look at me!" My neighbor collapsed on his knees, clutched his head, and wept loudly. I, on the other hand, felt dizzy, and with every new knock at the door, everything inside froze, as if it were pounding on my chest. "Pasha!" cried the creature, and banged on the door so hard that it rattled. "Did you see everything? Pasha, I'm in the hatch. Pasha, look!" Pasha didn't answer. He was lying in the middle of the room, curled up in a ball, and I'm not sure he was conscious at the time. All this madness didn't last long. After a few more blows, everything went quiet, but a luscious corpse stench crept into the apartment, the kind that comes from decomposed carcasses of birds torn apart by cats. The horrible odor made me vomit, and with the vomit, apparently, all the fear came out, for after that I calmly got to my feet, got to the sofa and slept until morning. To describe further events, I am madly ashamed. In the morning, having made sure that Pashka was breathing, I did not wake him up and left the apartment. The whole day passed in murky prostration and anxiety. My head was occupied by an obsessive idea to climb up the iron and look what hides behind the hatch, but I resisted it with all my might. After dinner, my strength was finally exhausted. I locked myself in my room and drank a whole bottle of vodka without refreshment, from which I soon fell asleep and woke up only early the next morning. From the apartment above came the echoes of songs. At that time, in my hangover, I thought that Pashka was drowning out his fear by listening to records on his electronica. I visited him in the afternoon, but he didn't open. He was nowhere to be found. It was the first time he didn't show up for his classes. After a couple of days, we were transferred to distance learning, but Pashka didn't show up for online classes either. By Friday, his mother and grandmother came to town. For a long time, with tears in their eyes, they asked me where their little blood was, and I didn't know what to say. On the same day the police arrived, the apartment was sealed at my grandmother's request. I was questioned and even persuaded to go to the police station. The relatives themselves went home, somewhere in the region, and the police were strictly instructed to take the strange neighbor into custody and not to let him out until Pashka's body was found. When the crying grandmother said, "Body," I shuddered, as if I believed that my classmate was really dead. However, after seeing the women off, the tired investigator asked me to sign the report and let me go without further questions. And yesterday, Saturday, as I was getting ready for bed, I suddenly heard the familiar melodic howling of Pashka's electronica record player. At first I thought I was imagining it, but then I clearly recognized the words of a familiar song by Alexander Bainov. I felt an electric shock of joy in my head, and I could hardly stand on my feet. In a frenzy, I rushed into the corridor, just to quickly see with my own eyes unharmed Pashka. Just as I was leaving the apartment, the elevator doors opened with a rumble. The light came on, and a small company of 4 people came out of the elevator. In euphoria, I said hello to them and almost jumped up the stairs. But immediately my joy was darkened by a bloody shroud over my eyes, and a rotten, stinking paw of horrible realization clutched at my soul. When I reached the passage between the floors, I saw that the light on the 9th was on. My back went cold. I leaned my hand against the wall, shivering, and began to rise uncertainly, keeping my eyes on the door slowly appearing from around the corner. My worst guesses were correct. The apartment was still sealed. I stood immovable, glaring at the door. The ringing voices of the merry company turned into a prolonged squeak. My ears popped as if I'd fainted, and then the metallic clang behind me was a test shot. The realization hit me, it was all one big trap. "Guys!" I yelled, my voice breaking. "Guys, hurry up and get over here." The voices fell silent, and their drunken owners stomped up the stairs, and the hatch clanked again. I bet that company still remembers me, barely breathing from the fright, running down the stairs to my apartment. A happy accident or the noble help of a higher power caught my eye during the ascent and prevented me from looking at what lurked on the iron staircase, waiting for a lone victim who came running to the familiar sounds of music. To this day, I'm still not sure if the presence of the merry quartet on my floor saved me if a quick glance had accidentally slipped a little to the left. I didn't immediately realize the simple truth. Having finished with Pashka, something from the hatch began to take care of the next witness. During my escape, the creature must have figured out the apartment I was living in. The knocking started earlier than Pashka's, and at 1:30 in the morning my door was almost walking with rhythmic beats. I crept up to it. "Who's there?" I asked. Silence. Looking through the peephole was scary as hell. I asked again, "Who is it?" "I'll call the cops. Help me. Spend the night at my place." Someone on the other side of the door wheezed. Yes, I had made a terrible mistake by talking to the otherworldly guest. My body felt cold, and a capillary in me must have burst. I jerked and jerked away from the door. "Let's go quickly. I'm afraid. I have to look in the hatch." My voice kept on. My strength was leaving me. I couldn't stand on my feet, but the peephole beckoned to me, begging me to look into it, and I dared not resist. And then I saw Pashka's smiling face resting peacefully on the bitten-off head. The creature, which looked exactly like my late grandmother, held Pashka's head by the hair in its sharp yellow teeth. Everything blurred in my eyes. Meanwhile, the creature raised a shapeless black hand, which looked like a mixture of a tentacle and a spider's foot, and closed my peephole. Another blow brought me to my senses, and I realized with horror that my hand was on the door lock, which had already been turned 1 turn out of 2. Screaming something unintelligible, I closed it again, grabbed my head with my hands, and ran to the bathroom, where I locked myself in, washed my face, and sat motionless for several minutes. The terrible knocking didn't stop until the morning. And I can't understand why the other neighbors can't hear it. Maybe it only affects a particular apartment? Is getting the poor victim to open the door? Now I am still sitting in my apartment on the 8th floor. The front iron door is securely locked on all turns. The windows are also closed and curtained, which makes all the rooms warmed by the heating very hot and stuffy. In this paneled bath, my thoughts are constantly confused. I sit at the table and write all this completely wet, as after a shower. My feet stick to the leather chair, my hands slip off the keys, and my clothes stink unbearably. But I dare not even get up from my seat and go to wash until I finish my story. I feel a great responsibility placed upon my shoulders, and it will be a great joy to me if the story reaches anyone. I won't hide it. I'm afraid for myself, afraid to follow Pashka. I curse myself for leaving him, but I realize I couldn't have done otherwise. And no, I'm not going to be a hero, and I'm not going up on the roof even in the daytime. I don't want to deal with this. I don't want to see anything or anyone. Fear chokes me with a prickly cord, my temples throbbing painfully. It all feels like a looped nightmare, a maddening merry-go-round of horror, an incessant, ghastly movie. A few minutes ago, I heard Pashkin's voice from the entryway, calling out to me, shouting, "I saw it! I saw! Look!" And it's 12 o'clock, and the bright daylight has long since penetrated through the curtains into the room. And I overpower myself, rise from my seat, tiptoe to the door and look through the peephole, but it's always dark. It's still there. It won't go away. This is the end of the manuscript.